Welcome to whatever week this is, of whatever experience this is. I've lost count. I've stopped caring. Here's more content. I usually have really good videos this week to distract everyone before class. This is just a brief moment of them, and I will include links to them because you really should watch them. On the left is a stop-motion animation of how a Model 302 phone was assembled, and it really helps you appreciate the insides of this phone, the incredible complexity of something that was completely mechanical. On the right is an interview with Raymond Loewy and his beautiful wife Viola that's worth watching because it really helps you understand his public persona and how manicured that was. So this week I'm taking another pause from the normal trajectory of a chronology of design history to talk about the development of the professional of industrial design. And I'm being a little bit sneaky. I'm using Raymond Loewy and Henry Dreyfuss to do this, partly because they are really important designers and they deserve a little bit more attention than they would have gotten if I just shoved them in the regular flow. But also they were two of the big names at the very beginning of industrial design, and they helped establish all of the professional practices that we still use today. And looking at how they developed their industrial design firms and how they ran them will help us understand how the profession designed and really how many options you have in considering how you want to be doing it yourselves. The parallelness, if that's a word, of their stories and of their careers offers really good comparisons and lets us appreciate the larger trajectory of design in general in their time. They lived at the same time, they worked at the same time, they began their professional careers at the beginning of industrial design. They worked on similar projects and they had a similar longevity. They also had a similar fame in their day and have helped influence and inspire people since in a similar kind of way. Let's start with Raymond Loewy. Loewy was born in France but spent most of his professional career in the United States. He had a long career, it spanned 70 years. This is him on the cover of Time magazine in 1949. At the time, his office was bringing in $3 million a year. That's about $30 million today. And sales of his designs was estimated at over $1 billion. That's over $10 billion today. I want to point out that Loewy made it onto the cover of Time magazine through the efforts of his press secretary, Betty Reese. Without Betty Reese, this would never have happened. This is going to be the story of two famous men whose names are on the front door of their office, but there's teams of people in the background making this all happen. And that's the way design firms work. Here's a quotation from Raymond Loewy so you can appreciate his ideas and hear a little bit of his voice. "I believe in natural talent. If you don't have it, do something else. Don't bother about sociology and ideology. What you need is good knowledge of engineering, paper, pencils, and a slide rule, common sense, and a respect for the arts of the past." That's an ego speaking. It's like, you got it or you don't, and I got it. And I paired it with this really strange picture of Loewy leering at, I think it's a razor of some kind, I'm not even sure. Loewy got his first industrial design commission in 1929. By 1954, he had over 200 employees in his New York office, as well as offices in London and in Paris. He had homes, many of them. He had a duplex in New York City, a house in Palm Springs, California, a house in Mexico, a house in Saint-Tropez, a house in Long Island. I want to take a moment to talk about this image because it's a famous image. It's usually shown and described as Raymond Loewy in his office, and it's not. This is an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York from 1934. And this was the industrial designer's office, but it's a completely fake promotional creation. It's not actually what anyone's office ever looked like. There is a clay model of the Hupmobile that Loewy had designed, but that's about the only evidence of productivity that's going on in this picture. But it does show you how stylish he was and how much image was part of what he did. Loewy claimed that at 15 years old, he made a model plane that won the James Gordon Bennett Cup in 1908. He then went on to manufacture and sell the plane, which he called the Arel, and then he later sold that company. Most of Loewy's origin story comes from Loewy himself, and it's almost all manufactured. That doesn't mean there aren't grains of truth in there, but you really have to approach it with skepticism. James Gordon Bennett was a millionaire who owned the New York Herald and the International Heralds, and he sponsored races for yachts and for automobiles, as well as a race for hot air balloons starting in 1906. Another race was added for powered flight in 1909, so certainly transportation competitions and James Gordon Bennett are related. But I can find no record of a competition for toy planes or model planes. I don't know how Loewy's story could possibly be accurate. I also don't know if he invented what we now know of as the rubber band propellered balsa wood airplane, but that's essentially what he made and sold. Whatever the truth is in this, what we can learn about Loewy is that from a very young age he understood the value of design and he was enterprising. He wrote that this established in my mind some hints of what design, inventiveness, and enterprise might mean in my later life. Success became more than an unattainable abstraction. Loewy moved to New York and worked as a window dresser for department stores and a fashion illustrator for Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. And he wrote, "The Great Depression shook America and my life. I decided that my fashion sketches and Chinatown days were over and that more serious challenges should be faced." And that's the standard trajectory for the early industrial designers. They were in an associated field like illustration or set design, and the Depression offered an opportunity to enter design for manufacturing, and design for manufacturing needed industrial designers to find new ways that design and manufacturing could help dig companies out of the recession. Because Loewy understood marketing and design, art and commerce, he spent the rest of his professional career combining those two. It's a really sound foundation for industrial design work. Also, I wanted to show you as many of his early illustrations as I can find correctly attributed to him, because, and my notes here just say, because dude could draw. We're going to look at a lot of things later that have his name on them that he probably didn't actually create, but certainly he had the skills. Loewy moved from fashion illustration to industrial design by intent. He printed a business card that said, between two products equal in price, function, and quality, the better looking will outsell the other. That's kind of ballsy, right? Like, I'll just print a business card that says I do this thing that I've never done, and I'll hand it out. He gave it to every executive he could find, and when he met Sigmund Gestetner, he got his first chance to practice. Gestetner manufactured duplicating machines. Anyone my age remembers them. You put a template on the drum, you turn the handle, and hot liquid ink is squeezed through the template onto paper. And this was how documents were copied before we had Xerox machines or scanners. Even this very earliest project of Raymond Loewy's shows a lot of what Loewy did throughout his career, and he wrote about this era of manufactured objects. "I was amazed at the chasm between the excellent quality of much American production and its gross appearance, clumsiness, bulk, and noise. I could not imagine how such brilliant manufacturers, scientists, and businessmen could put up with it for so long." It's tempting to be envious of these early industrial designers because any of us could accomplish this. The thing on the left had never been cared about. No one cared what it looked like. The thing on the right had some entry-level care. That doesn't mean that Loewy wasn't doing a really remarkable job right out of the gate, not only with this project, but with all his projects, at translating something from never considered to really nicely considered. This is not a design that's based only on aesthetics. The outside housing sort of puts a barrier between the user and the insides that the user doesn't have to know about, and then leaves outside of that all the parts that we need to operate the device. So the ink stays inside, not getting all over your clothes. You only have access to the parts that you need. You also then have a cleanable surface. The description of this redesign says that it's made in Bakelite, cast plastic. To me, it looks like it could also be stamped metal, so I'm not entirely certain about that. But Loewy designed this in his apartment, working with modeling clay. He claimed to be the person who introduced that technique to industrial design. We can't know, but certainly the ability to create a smooth, unified shape out of clay allowed Loewy to think about the outside form of objects in a way that people hadn't been before him. He designed the Sears cold spot refrigerator. On the left is the monitor top from 1927, where the motor and the cooling agent is on top, and on the right is the redesign from 1935. And he wrote about this: "When we began our design, the cold spot unit then on the market was ugly. It was an ill-proportioned vertical shoebox, decorated with a maze of moldings and panels, perched on spindly legs high off the ground, and the latch was a pitiful piece of cheap hardware. We solved all these problems in no time." I already talked in Art Deco Week about streamlining and showed you this refrigerator with its vertical stripes that create that beautiful aesthetic and unify all the parts of this, but also introduce rigidity to thin sheet metal. I want to show you as much process as I can this week because this is the first time there are designer archives that I can use to find primary source documents to explain how things happened. And I love this slide because it has two images of the same object that were created for different functions and as a result are really subtly different. I hope all of my students already understand what's going on with these two images. The picture on the right is from Loewy's archive, and it's a photograph of the refrigerator. The refrigerator looked like this. And even that is interesting because you see the vertical stripes down the front of the refrigerator are transferred to the inside over the freezer door and over the compartments at the bottom. But the image on the left is an illustration from the sales brochure. It still looks like the same refrigerator, but do you see what's wrong with that image? It has two different vanishing points. The outside refrigerator has one horizon line, and the inside of the refrigerator has a completely different, unrelated horizon line. It's been manipulated so that we can better see all of the features. We can see the wire racks, we can see that it comes with a rolling pin you can fill with water, a refrigerator dish, and lots of space for your food. This refrigerator sold extremely well. Sales went in 1935 from $65,000 a year to $275,000 a year. Now, part of that is because more people had electricity and so they could have a refrigerator, but a lot of that is the appearance of this object. This was the first object that proved that appearance as a sales tool had value, just like Loewy's business card said. And because the sales were so strong, all other manufacturers looked to the equation and realized that it was adding an industrial designer that allowed this to happen. So industrial designers in general got a huge boost because of this project. Loewy went on to continue designing for Sears with annual updates, kind of like the car industry would develop. In 1940, handles were added that worked like a car handle, and a storage drawer below was added. Also, the shelves had been hand-assembled metal wire, which was rust-proofed, and they rusted anyway. So Loewy introduced a switch to perforated and ribbed aluminum extrusions, which were cheaper to manufacture, lighter weight, and more durable. Later versions included a feather touch latch, a foot pedal, so you could open the refrigerator with your hands full. Loewy opened an office in London in the mid-1930s, and by 1938 he had become a US citizen. So here's the Loewy equation: arrive, improve, leave. Swoop in, redesign, transform, go away. This is a great example of that. This is a 1945 Cream Separator. It may surprise you to find out that I did not grow up on a farm. So my technical description of what this thing does is you put stuff from cow in the top, and you turn it on, and somehow you get cream in one container and milk in another. But you can see the object on the left, again, has not been designed. It's merely been engineered to work. And there's a lot that can go wrong with it. It has a motor that's contained in a cage so you don't catch your clothing or your hair or your fingers. But every day this object needs to be washed off at the end of the day, because if you have hot stuff from cow on farm overnight in summer, you have a problem. And you can see on the right, in operation, that cage was always missing because it just made it harder to clean. Loewy's redesign, again, put the stuff you need access to on the outside of the shell and the stuff you don't need to know about on the inside. That made this much easier to clean every day. You could hose it down. But then it also gave Loewy the opportunity to create a really beautiful object and really interesting looking forms. So a lot of people say that all Raymond Loewy did was swoop in and streamline things and leave, but I think if you examine the logic behind that streamlining, you'll see that it's performing a function. In 1935, Loewy had 12 clients, but by 1940, he had 60 employees and a duplex office with a penthouse. That's the picture on the top. So unlike the picture in the Metropolitan Museum, this is actually his office, but it has been just as staged as that earlier picture. There are people on the left visiting, so there's a social aspect. There's Loewy and I believe his wife observing an employee putting the final touches on a clay model, and in the background you can see an image of a famous train that he designed. So this is a complete fiction. That model was finished long before fellow in lab coat arrived for this photo shoot. The image on the bottom is actually his office around 1950, at which point he had over 150 clients and 200 employees, so the Loewy office was a really major concern. He also had offices in London and in Paris. He had really big jobs from a really broad range of customers. For anyone looking for where the women are in these stories, I believe that that is his first wife in the picture at the top, Jean Thompson Bienfait, and she's a woman who really needs more attention, and I hope someday will get that attention. She was his official business partner from 1944 on. They were married in 1931 and divorced in 1945. She stayed working at the firm after their divorce and was a really important part of how that firm succeeded, and that's all I know about her. In 1948, he remarried Violet Erickson, who will appear in all the later pictures of him. In 1952, Loewy's office got the opportunity to redesign the original Coca-Cola contour bottle, the super iconic Coca-Cola bottle. Some people today are confused and say that Loewy designed the Coca-Cola bottle, but it had been around for many decades by the time Loewy arrived in the conversation. He saw that the logo was molded into the glass and hard to read, especially when full of soda with a dark liquid inside. So he removed that molded surface and created a logo in white, which was easier to read against the soda. He also added other size bottles, realizing that people wanted different amounts of soda. The first king size and mini size bottles were added at this point. And then later in 1960, he got to design the first Coca-Cola Steel Can with the diamond pattern design. For Coca-Cola, Loewy also designed surface treatments for all of their distribution devices, coolers, vending machines, and soda fountain dispensers, because he realized that anywhere you encounter the product, you should be encountering an advertisement for that product. That's part of our world today. We totally understand it, but it was something relatively new in the 50s. Loewy had a lifelong love of cars, and that provides our only real through narrative for all of his design work. There wasn't any one particular category he focused on, but if we look at his transportation design, and cars especially, we can watch his development over time. On the left is a patent that he filed in 1928, so before he had even designed anything that went into production. He had ideas about what a car could be, and he filed a patent to let the world know that Raymond Loewy had better ideas about cars. He proposed a slanted windshield, a shaped body, so not just a box, a rounded roof, shaped fenders, inset headlights. All of these features from 1928 were novel at the time and are still visible 30 years later in his Avanti design, and I would argue are still current looking today. For comparison, on the left is a 1928 Ford Model A and the Loewy drawing from the exact same year to give you a sense of how different they are. I have slowly been teasing out the information from Loewy's own published works. He used the image on the bottom right as evidence of his patent design, but the actual patent image, now available thanks to Google patent searches, is subtly different and a little less radical. I just want to remind you that anytime you hear Loewy's voice, you have to wonder how true it is, because he was adept at augmenting reality to suit his own narrative. His first real opportunity to delve into a realized car was for Hotmobile. On the upper left is the existing car, and on the right is a photograph of the model of Loewy's redesign. And on the lower left is a side view photograph of the model with callouts added right to the photograph. And both of these process pictures show us an interesting use of photography. Make a small model that's very carefully detailed and photograph it to suggest that it's a full-size object. An elevation photograph of the model with callouts to explain all of the different details would be a useful conversation tool. Throughout his career, Loewy was critical of decoration for decoration's sake. These are some really lovely photographs he took in the 1950s of cars made in Detroit that Loewy objected to because they just had random fins and chrome attachments for no particular reason except decoration. And this is another great process tool. Loewy wanted something for scale so he could prove that these fins were really ridiculously large, so he had his wife hold their dog up in the picture, Poodle as ruler. Loewy's cars use form to create decoration. And throughout his life, he produced a series of speculative designs for his own use, where he would purchase an existing car and transform it into a dream version of that car. On the top is the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado, and on the bottom is Loewy's redesign. He took this project on in advance of a family trip to Europe, and this was the car they drove through Europe in. His daughter Laurence wrote, "I remember visiting the metal shop with Mom and watching Dad taking a cutting torch to neuter the chrome-plated barge. He started with the giant fins and didn't stop until he cut off 150 pounds of bulky, chrome-plated extras." Loewy had a long relationship with Studebaker Cars beginning in 1936. At first, he just designed a few new logos or badges for them, but then he went on to design a number of cars. And there's an interesting component to this story. War restrictions at the Big Three, at Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, prevented work on civilian automobiles. Loewy's firm was independent, not an in-house designer, so those restrictions did not apply to him or to Studebaker. As a result, when the war ended, there was a huge demand for cars. There were 4 years of nobody in America buying new cars. And Studebaker was ready to go with new designs all spec'd out and ready for tooling, whereas the other car makers had to reconvert to peacetime manufacturing of automobiles and start the design process all over. So Studebaker was a full 2 years ahead of the other car makers. And as a result, the 1947 Commander was a very successful car. That's partly because of logistics, but it's also because Raymond Loewy understood what would happen after the war, which is that there would be young couples with children who needed a car. And this car is a fun car. It's shown in red. It had a wraparound window in the back that the kids could look out. Part of what made the Studebaker so exciting is Loewy's approach to form. Because he used modeling clay, he worked in 3 dimensions, and that liberated him, in a sense, from caring about manufacturability first. This process became a standard one for car design. Models were developed at scale to explore the different options. Once there was a more final idea of what the car would be, a full-size model was made over wooden bucks, a wooden frame covered with clay. That clay is then warmed in a huge electric oven to make it more malleable and sculpted and refined. Loewy perfected this technique in his office when he was working on the cold spot and really used it in his car design. So visually, the reduced scale and the full-scale models looked as much like the finished car as possible. This technique is still used in auto design, even with all of our CAD and 3D modeling opportunities. I love this image, though, because it's the 2 designers of the new Beetle from 1991 pretending that they've just been sculpting this clay model. You know, they just walked into the photo studio and posed. Loewy had a separate studio just for car design in South Bend. This is an image of Raymond Loewy on the right and Virgil Exner on the left, who did car design for Loewy and went on to become a very important person in Detroit in car design. But I really just wanted to show you this picture because of the frame in the front. This is a scale model in clay, and it's on a bed that slides back and forth, and it's got this arch over it that looks like La Défense in Paris, but it has holes that you can put pins through from either side. And this is just a really handy, fast way to maintain symmetry in a 3-dimensional model. So keep that in mind. It is very hard to do accurate symmetry when you're sculpting something. There are things you can understand from an actual 3-dimensional model that no amount of CAD software will ever replicate. And I love this image because it's showing 2 half models put next to each other to investigate where the air intake could go and how that would affect the sort of stance and attitude of the car. So you could make a half model and put it up against another one. You could also make a half model and put it up against a mirror and relatively quickly investigate what a complete car would look like. Working in clay allowed Loewy to work in 3 dimensions instead of drawings, which I think is evident in the outcome of all of the Studebaker cars. These were for a young audience and they were fun, and that was a big part of what Loewy was able to accomplish with his recessed headlights, his angled windshields, his angled grills. In 1961, Loewy was called back to Studebaker because at that point their buyers were not young anymore and they wanted to try and attract the young buyers. He was given a very, very tight time constraint, 40 days, to produce a finished design and a scale model. He assembled a team and he sequestered them in a house in Palm Springs. So he stayed at his luxury estate in Palm Springs and his team worked away nearby so he could supervise them. They accomplished the goal, they finished the car on time, it became an instant classic. And you could argue that it's because Loewy's team was so good and locked away until they finished this, that they met that deadline. But you could also argue that Loewy had a lifetime of understanding cars and thinking about this to hand off to them. So they started this design project with a really fully formed idea of what they were doing in the first place. Loewy wrote this about the 1961 Avanti. The chief engineer at Porsche asked me, "How did you wind test the Avanti? We know a little here about streamlining, and your Avanti is almost perfect. No parasitic noise at high speed, skin friction reduced to practically nothing." I said I didn't test it at all. I did it by feel and design intuition. So is that a bunch of BS? Yes, of course. But at the same time, no, of course I believe that. When you have a lifetime of experience, you can rely on design intuition and feel, which doesn't mean that it's not also infused with a heavy dose of science and accuracy. The renderings on the right were produced by Loewy's office, but not by him. These drawings are more likely to be by him. In 1978, Loewy needed some money, and so he put together a portfolio. He redrew some of his classic designs and sold a limited edition of these prints. So we know that he actually did do these drawings, and it's clear that he had a real mastery of understanding how to communicate attitude in a drawing. There's a lot to learn from both of these drawings. Lower your horizon line, and you raise yourself up in the perspective field, so you're looking down on something, and you see it more as an object. If you raise your horizon line and lower your point of view, the object looms over you. So Loewy was able to create a sense of speed and attitude by controlling how he put the car on a piece of paper, and I think there's a lot we can all learn from that. This is a proposal for a station wagon version of the Avanti, which was never realized because the Avanti was not a commercial success. Studebaker wound up closing in 1963. The car has remained legendary and influential, certainly, but it wasn't able to do for Avanti what they hoped for financially. Loewy had a long love affair with cars. He worked on production cars, on limited production cars, and also concept cars. So I already mentioned that he frequently redesigned his own cars. Sometimes he would buy a car and restyle it for himself. Sometimes he would do this at the behest of the car maker to investigate some other opportunities that they could think about pursuing. This is a Jaguar Xk 140 that he redesigned, and I've only recently found the picture on the lower left, which is from the Hagley archive, that really beautifully shows not only the wooden buck being made for the clay model, but drawings right on the photograph in blue ink and red ink to indicate where it needed to be changed. There's another picture of the realized prototype on the left, and another one of his prototype cars, the BMW 507, both photographed at his estate in France. And I love the upper right picture. That's his beautiful wife Viola in the car being served a cocktail before going off for a drive. Here's another custom number, the Lancia Loremo, and Loremo is Raymond Loewy reorganized. There's a pro tip. If you invent something, just use your name and scramble the letters. I love this car. It looks like some kind of dog or an anteater or an animal of some kind. This crazy asymmetry in the projecting snout. It has a couple of Loewy standards. You can see on the hood there's this asymmetrical vent. Loewy liked using that because when driving you could look across the hood and use that vent to register where the far side of the car was. In addition to designing fantasy cars and really beautiful discursive cars, Loewy worked for Detroit. When the United States government asked the four automakers to develop experimental safety cars in 1970, Loewy was brought in by Chrysler to design their testing car. And in 1972, Loewy's testing car for Chrysler survived an impact at 50 miles an hour in a head-on collision with a concrete wall. It was the only one of the cars to survive that test. So that goes back to Loewy's ability to use design intuition and his innate understanding of cars to arrive at design success. Other more practical, more user-focused transportation design is also evident in Loewy's work. In 1940, Architectural Forum wrote, "Loewy is the only designer in the United States who can cross the country in cars, buses, trains, and aircraft he has designed himself." He started working for Greyhound in 1933, and his first design in the patent on the left was really just a new paint application for an existing bus. But very quickly he transformed everything that Greyhound was manufacturing, as well as their logo. He redrew the dog. I love these drawings of the Scenic Cruiser from 1933, which he then revised in 1946, which is the lower right-hand image. On the upper left, you see a really beautiful perspective drawing with a cutaway section. This is the most amount of communication you could put in a drawing. With very few lines, it shows you the outside shape, it gives a suggestion of the sort of attitude of the object and what the skin would look like, but you also see the interior layout and the functional decisions about how space would be used. I also want to point out that I'm showing you a lot more patents now than I have so far this semester. Designers were starting to use patents in a way more intentional way. On the top is the design patent for the 1933 bus he redesigned that shows the beautiful corrugated metal side, which says I'm fast and I have speed lines, but also gives metal structure so it could still have strength but be thinner metal and make the bus lighter. And on the bottom is the utility patent that shows the actual invention being discussed. Design patents had been around for almost 100 years, but at this point industrial designers are starting to use them in a variety of interesting ways as a business practice. Loewy also designed a number of now iconic trains, and I showed the image on the lower left in the Art Deco week just to put in the timeline of this class that product was happening then, but I want to talk more about it now. Again, it's low-hanging fruit. The train on the left no one had ever designed, the train on the right is bound to look better. But Loewy managed in one effort to take many steps ahead. The Broadway Limited in 1936 was a really beautiful creation. There was then a later version created in 1939 that was on exhibit at the World's Fair. Loewy did not design the equally famous GG1, which was an electric locomotive. He improved its appearance, he recommended welding it instead of riveting it so you'd have a smooth surface, and he added the pinstripe paint scheme that goes from the front along to the back of the engine. One of the problems with this is that the entire housing was one welded unit. So when the train needed repairs, it had to be driven into a building with a crane. The shroud had to be lifted off for the repairs to happen. That's one of the reasons the T1, the engine that Loewy did design start to finish, has exposed machinery. He designed it to have a cover panel so only the wheels were visible. In use, that was almost always removed as well, but I think either way the train looks equally powerful because of that contrast of the sculpted shape, which just looks fast even when it's not moving, and all of the exposed mechanisms. The T1, which was nicknamed Shark Nose, was one of the last steam-powered locomotives made. Loewy also designed the stations, the passenger car interiors, and all the advertising material that went with this train. I assembled a talk years ago on the United States Post Office Pioneers of Industrial Design postage stamps. It was so exciting that they made them, but the choices were really weird. So I proposed alternates. One of the things I wanted across the bottom of the stamp page was this T1, but those businessmen were in my way. But thanks to the magic of Photoshop, I was able to use the image anyway. The post office never got back to me. Here's an image of Loewy actually drawing. But was he drawing, or did he just walk over in front of the camera and pick up a pencil and put it near a drawing that was already being done? By 1949, Loewy employed 143 designers and architects and draftsmen and had multiple business partners. A. Baker Bernhardt, William Snaith, and John Breen were all partners in his business, and it's likely that other people were doing most of these drawings. So the train at the top, from about 1937, could well be by Raymond Loewy, but we know the drawing at the bottom was. It's one of the recreated images from later. Loewy's increasing high profile led to higher profile clients. In 1963, he was hired to redesign Air Force One and got to work with John F. Kennedy on this project. The plane on top is how Loewy found it, with the very small American flag that's engaged by the red stripe on the tail and kind of confusing as a result, with United States of America in small lettering that's difficult to read, and with an application of red, white, and blue that says American, but not in any meaningful way. The redesign on the bottom is full of subtlety that has a lot to teach us. Loewy disengaged the flag and made it enormous. He made the United States of America much larger, but the sneakiest thing he did was to put the seal of the president huge right next to the door. So every time Air Force One landed and the door opened and the president came out, the photograph of that event included the seal in the background. This is such a wonderful, strange document. It lives at the Hagley Archive, and it is an elevation outline that looks like my 3-year-old could have drawn it. I don't even have a 3-year-old. But I love it because it's great evidence of not bothering to spend time on something that can be investigated quickly. The fastest way to explore different color applications is to just take some colored pencils and scribble. And then when you get one you like, spend your time doing something that involves more effort. Loewy's graphic application to Air Force One has been reapplied to subsequent airplanes successfully. So the airplanes have changed, but they all look the same because this application is so flexible and can really go on almost any kind of airplane. It's been in use for almost 60 years, but unfortunately has just been decommissioned by a president who doesn't see the value of hiring designers. Loewy also worked on the Concorde, which was a British and French turbojet supersonic passenger jet airliner. It went over 1,300 miles an hour. It could get from New York to London in just over 3 hours. And it seated around 100 passengers, 92 to 128, depending on configuration. The Concorde arrived in 1969. Loewy got involved redesigning the interior in 1976. And this picture would be very easy to ignore as just something that's white above and gray below. But I think there's so much subtlety in this redesign. The Concorde was very small. In order to make it as light as possible and control the outside shape, the inside was essentially just an elongated tube. By creating a horizon line and making everything below monochromatic gray and everything above white, with indirect lighting washing over the surfaces, it has this really calming effect that would make it seem less like a sardine can and more like a luxury travel experience. For this product, he also designed the cutlery. And I have an emotional attachment to this cutlery because Air France used it in plastic, not in stainless steel, in all of their flights throughout the 80s. And I'm not going to say that I stole some, but I do have really good picnic flatware. From 1939 to 1955, Loewy worked for Frigidaire, which was a branch of General Motors. And he used what he knew from the automobile world, stamped panels of enameled metal trimmed with chrome detail, to design stoves. He also convinced them to apply standards and introduce a 40-inch standard width stove. The text in this ad is hilarious. It says, "A charming housewife gracefully displaying her Raymond Loewy design to a lady truly astonished by its irresistible beauty." I don't care about the beauty of that stove. I bring Loewy's appliance design into the conversation because it was involved in a really famous moment in American history, global history, and design history. The picture on the upper left is US Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at the opening of the American National Exhibition at Sokolniki Park in Moscow in 1959. Hopefully, my students have all read The Kitchen Debates, where Nixon and Khrushchev are arguing about the benefits of capitalism or communism while looking at the kitchen of this American dream home. And when Nixon points out all of the amazing appliances that make our housewives' lives better, Khrushchev replied, "Don't you have a machine that puts food in the mouth and pushes it down?" Ironically, Loewy was hired by the Soviet Union in 1973 as a design consultant to help get cars and farm tractors and cameras and motorcycles and things up to speed because the Soviet Union realized they weren't really doing industrial design as well as they needed to be. But isn't it wonderful that this important conversation from the history of politics was sparked by the work of an American industrial designer? Okay, stick with me. You may think this is weird. Newman patented the first felt-tip marking pen in 1910. It had a cylinder filled with ink and a detachable felt tip. And then Benjamin Pascich patented something called a fountain paintbrush in 1926. It used a sponge-tipped paint container. Neither one of these was commercially viable and neither one was sold. But thanks to patent searches, if you want to know the history of the marker, you can. Magic Marker is a brand that was introduced in 1953, and it was a glass tube of ink with a felt wick. And then in 1962, the fiber tip pen was introduced. Yukio Horie of the Tokyo Stationery Company filed this patent, and in the description it says, "A marking pen includes a tubular pen body which holds a core having a tip through which ink flows. A core for a marking pen includes a bunch of rod-like elements or monofilaments." Why am I mentioning all of this? There's a dramatic change in how people drew in the late 1960s because magic markers arrived. When you're drawing with an ink pen, you have to draw in one direction only. Or if you're using a rapidograph pen, which has a tube, you have to hold it completely vertical. So you're really limited in how you can create marks. When you have a magic marker with a felt tip or a bundle of monofilaments, and the ink is dispersed whichever way you draw, you can go back and forth. That introduces a lightness of line, a sketchiness, and an energy that completely changes the way drawings looked in design offices. And I just think that's worth noticing because these drawings from the Loewy office of their work with NASA are really exciting to look at. And part of the reason why is the quality of line. In 1967, the Loewy office was retained by NASA as habitability consultant, which is anything related to the psychophysiological safety and comfort of the astronauts. I had to read that. I don't use those words on my own. Loewy's work for NASA and the Skylab space station included the first interior design standards for space travel, which included a porthole to allow a view of Earth from space, and we're going to revisit that when we look at the birth of the environmental movement, because it's a really fascinating and important component of that story. Loewy's office also looked at interior designs, color schemes, private areas for crew members to relax and sleep, food tables, trays, coveralls, garment storage modules, and even designs for waste management, because someone's got to take care of that. Loewy's office also worked on habitation studies for the Saturn Apollo and the Skylab projects, and also worked on the Apollo mission interiors. I'm only showing you these drawings because they're lovely to look at, but the drawing on the right is fascinating. In a zero-gravity environment, putting on a spacesuit is a challenge. This proposal shows a sort of railing the astronaut can grip and lower themselves into the suit, and that railing is pumping air into the suit to inflate it. Loewy was most proud of this NASA chapter, and there are many promotional pictures of Loewy with NASA stuff all around him. These are images from the Skylab project and also a space maintenance taxi. There's almost not a corporation that Loewy didn't logoify. Is logoify a word? Should be. He started in 1942 with the Lucky Strike package in the lower right. He also redesigned the Shell logo, BP, Exxon, many logos that are still in our world decades later. The story of the Exxon logo is classic Raymond Loewy. Here's what he wrote about it. In 1966, the company had decided to change the name from Esso into another one. We signed a contract and I left immediately for my winter residence in Palm Springs, California. In less than a week, I found the name I wanted, Exxon, and I made 96 rough pencil sketches on the word, placing the visual emphasis on the double X's. So here's the thing. Did Esso, which is a major global corporation, have no idea what its name was going to be and Raymond Loewy just made it up for them? I find that hard to believe. Nevertheless, looking at Loewy's sketches of all the different letter combinations that could happen, you can see that he got 90% of the DNA of this logo really quickly with a pencil, and then several degrees even more accurately with just a simple red marker. So going back again to his design intuition, there is something to his genius. You just have to scratch at the surface of the way he describes it to understand it. And at the bottom I put a picture of his custom designed car and his beautiful wife Viola arriving at his Palm Springs, California residence. I will try and find a video showing this house, because there are several now that it's been sold a few times. It's a remarkable place, and you will enjoy seeing his swimming pool that goes into the living room. In the 1970s, the Loewy office designed modular units to create a consistent shell station look that was adaptable to different scales and circumstances. So you could have a concrete pad with one bay or two bay and an office or a repair bay or a restroom bay, and then put a huge roof over all of it. And from a distance it looked like architecture, but up close it was really just a kit of little parts. And these drawings say Maya on them because by this point Loewy had developed a way of thinking, which I hope you read about in the Industrial Design Reader. Maya stands for Most Advanced Yet Acceptable Thinking. And Loewy wrote, there seems to be for each individual product or service or storage or package a critical area at which the consumer's desire for novelty reaches what I might call the shock zone. He was saying that it's our job as designers to push our clients outside of what they think they want. Shell said they wanted new buildings. Loewy arrived at something that transcended the concept of a building, much more advanced, and yet it was still acceptable because it still suited the requirements of Shell and the project. In today's design education and design practice, a lot of people focus on discursive design and way out blue sky thinking, and I get frustrated by that because unless things can get made, they're really not going to help change the world and solve problems. So I try and remember Loewy's imperative that it's our job to be discursive and push the boundaries and the expectations of our clients while also satisfying their real-world requirements. This project also used customer interviews and customer observation in a nice way. At the time, service stations were trying to remove full service from the equation to save money on employees and let people fill up their own cars, and nobody would use them. So Loewy's office sent people out to interview customers and find out why they wouldn't use the self-serve, and they found out that most people were getting gas on their way to work in their work clothes, and the hose was on the ground and they didn't want to get dirty. So by attaching the hose from above, they removed that problem from the equation. Also, because I was in retail for years, I love the oil cart on the lower right. This is a really smart design. It is a single piece of plastic vacuum formed into a shelving system to hold containers of oil, and it's molded so that the hand truck snaps right in. So at the end of the day, you just wheel this back in the garage, and in the morning you wheel it out. You have a mobile display for your oil. Loewy's US office was forced to close in 1977 because of bankruptcy, but his European office has stayed open and continued to design interesting things. Loewy himself retired in 1980 and returned to France. He died in his Monte Carlo residence in 1986 at the age of 93. He published 2 books in his lifetime. A bestseller in 1951 called Never Leave Well Enough Alone, but the subtitle is really worth reading. In script there it says, The Personal Record of an Industrial Designer from Lipsticks to Locomotives. And then in 1979, another book came out, which is mostly an interview with later illustrations of his work. And that's where a lot of the quotations I read you came from, which is why I think they're so suspect. This is a designer later in his career looking back and also trying to sort of reestablish his importance and his finances. Henry Dreyfuss, whom we're going to look at in the second half, said at a meeting of the Society of Industrial Designers, "We all know about Raymond Loewy and publicity, but let's not forget that he is the best advertisement this profession has. Without him, the profession would be very different." So take a break, have some ice cream, practice your jump roping, have a Zoom call with your grandparents, watch the videos that I linked to at the beginning, and come back for the second half where we'll look at the other side of this equation by examining the work of Henry Dreyfuss. I don't know what the first half of that sentence was, so now I can't finish it. Let's just hope it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And I made 96 rough pencil sketches. That's the second time I can't say pencil. 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 It's not Russian. It's not pencil. Interestingly. Why do I always say interestingly? Maybe it's not interesting. Take a break to rub your nose. How come I never have to yawn except when I'm recording stuff? I don't know. I have to get my tie right. My tie's not in the middle. Everything's backwards on this camera, and I don't understand which way it needs to move. Oh, whatever. It's just a tie. Who cares? At least I'm not wearing sweatpants.